Good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Patricia Cranz, Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. Our program tonight is very timely: how journalists are finding ways to evade coverage restrictions, which seem to be getting more and more widespread. Tonight we'll hear from a great group of journalists who find ways around these restrictions. Mohammed Mhawish is a Palestinian from Gaza who's covered the war there from both inside and outside the territory. Nilo Tabrizy is an investigative journalist who's worked extensively with open source material to report on Iran for the Washington Post and the New York Times. She's also a governor of the OPC. Stephen Eisenhammer is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and the Reuters Bureau Chief for Mexico and Central America. He was part of the Reuters team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 2025 for the series Fentanyl Express. Stephen is also a three-time winner of Overseas Press Club Awards. Greg Myrie, NPR's national security correspondent, will be the moderator. Greg is also a governor of the OPC. And I'd like to also thank Sandra Stevenson and Amran Abakar, who helped us set up this program. So please put any questions you have in the chat, and Greg will take them up at the appropriate time. So now I hand it over to you, Greg. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks for the great introduction. And we have a wonderful panel with us here this evening. As Patricia mentioned, feel free to start putting questions in at any time, and we promise we'll get to them. Nilu, I'd like to start with you, given the urgency of what we're seeing and not seeing in the war in Iran. As somebody who's trying to cover this from afar, and I understand you're in Canada, near Vancouver right now, what are you seeing? What are you not seeing? How are you seeing? And what do you want to see? Just give us a sense of what you can and can't see.
Sure. So obviously, access is such an issue when it comes to covering Iran. And so, what we rely on are videos that come from eyewitnesses that eyewitnesses take at great personal cost. And so, typically, how this environment, this ecospheres works is that many eyewitnesses take videos. They send them to Telegram channel admins who themselves are these citizen journalists that have 500,000, 600,000, a million subscribers in their channels. They'll send the videos directly to the admins and it'll be shared on Telegram. And then most often, some of those videos, some of the most, egregious ones that might show state violence or civilian casualties, some of those will make their ways onto X, where, a wider range of people will see it because obviously Telegram is a predominantly Persian-speaking environment. But it's been really difficult. I mean, from the first day of the airstrikes, the internet was just completely shut off. And Iranians have been experiencing this. I mean, just the massacre was only a few weeks ago. So Iranians have now spent almost a quarter of the year in complete internet connectivity blackout, which is just unfathomable. So for me, it's difficult to get in touch with my family members, my loved ones, let alone sources. And so what it's looked like for me is my sources who might have other circumvention methods like Starlink might connect every few days, and I'll get drips of information from them. And I'll learn how, state security forces, even under airstrikes, are continuing to suppress people, intimidate people, and tell them to stay home. What we've seen in the last couple days is there's even been an increased crackdown on Starlink as well. So that lid is continuing to tighten, and so it makes it really difficult. And then the other aspect of it as well is satellite imagery. I mean, satellite imagery is so important to our jobs because we'll see, videos of the strike on the school in Minab, for example. Satellite imagery is very helpful because it helps us understand, was this an errant missile that dropped out of the sky, or was this a precision strike gone wrong, an issue of mistargeting? Satellite imagery is what allows us to see, oh, this complex got hit a few times. But now these satellite imagery companies in the US, whose number one customer base or their biggest client might be the Department of Defense, we're getting massive delays on satellite imagery for high resolution imagery. So it went from a 14-day delay to anything in the Persian Gulf. So anything that that might show US positions or allied positions that have been hit by Iran. Then there was a 96-hour delay on high-res imagery coming from Iran itself. And so we've had to figure out other ways, other forms of remote sensing that can provide more evidence to verify videos and to understand more about what we might be looking at.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Mohammed, I'd like you to talk about something, a slightly different challenge. When you were inside Gaza at the beginning of the war there in the fall of October of 23, you were inside, but getting the information out was the big challenge at that moment. Can you take us back to that time, talk about what it was like in Gaza, how you were doing things, just the nuts and bolts. I mean, how are you getting an internet connection? How are you talking to editors? How are you sending out material? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, of course, I think prior to October 7th, I think we've had experience and practice in terms of how to navigate the kind of environment in Gaza, since the kind of the norm was like living under a blockade where access to internet and connection to the outside world was always limited. But starting on October 7th, it was entirely different given the risks and the challenges that started to appear on a daily basis. And so I think what it was like, what it looked like day to day, you wake up, if you slept, and your first thought is how to report a story. um, that's that's just something that you were also living through. It was not, a story that, we were detached from. It was, as journalists and as reporters in Gaza, we were reporting on the same stories and, challenges that we were going through at the same time, along with the people that we were interviewing and talking to. So we were kind of like in the middle between like the witness and the reporter sort of like obligation. And on top of that, there was like the logistical kind of operational aspect of how that challenge was navigated. Um,
How is it?
Getting
Yeah,
on the internet
how
was
are you just getting an internet connection? How are you transmitting your material? And tell you were working with Al Jazeera at that time, correct?
it was an all-time challenge to get to find the internet connection and signal across Gaza at the time. I was based in Gaza City, and we were looking around to see the buildings that were least destroyed, the buildings that had connection towers still standing and intact on it. We were able to just be able to look for a way to get the equipment charged, to be able to connect to the internet wherever it felt safe. Having the phone and the SIM cards at the time, it was an extra layer of a challenge, because as reporters we thought these were ways like where actually were tracked and marked and targeted. So we were trying to avoid the kind of Wi-Fi connection. We thought eSIM cards, like the electronic SIM cards on the phone, were a viable option as well, but it was also risky at the same time. We were always trying to navigate connection away from telecoms companies that were not operating from inside Israeli territories. That was one thing. The other was like we were trying to get connection through satellite um, phones, and that was also a challenge because equipment inside Gaza, it was not really available at that point for everyone. Including just as
Just to drive that home, I mean, there is this double-edged sword that you're alluding to. It's like you want to find the place where you can communicate, but that also means it's easier for the Israelis to track. If you're seeing some place that has a working cell tower and a good connection, that might also
exactly.
either be a target or a way to track you, and that obviously was a life and death concern.
It was true indeed. I mean, at some point there was a sense of desperation because no matter what we tried, at the end of the day, there was no way to escape that matrix. I mean, we were always in the radar, and there was no way to escape the kind of watching from the military and to report a story that was entirely safe. So it was through the traditional kind of Wi-Fi connection. Whenever we had that available, it was either the SIM cards or the electronic SIM cards, because it was really hard to get physical cards at the time and keep switching between phones, or the satellite phones that were available and provided by the network to some level across parts in Gaza. And there were moments where we could, find ourselves connected to the internet through phones and, cellular data that was available to some other colleagues and peers on the ground, where we could be able to connect to each other and just, file the stories, maybe sometimes through the voice command option on the phone, because like, you're always on the move, you're always running, and you're always on the, hunt for a story to keep us, to keep the world informed, to keep the world connected to the situation and what's happening. And at the same time, it was as risky for you as a journalist there, navigating that kind of logistical challenge while also trying to stay safe. And one of the strategies that people, including myself, we would do back there is, whenever we had the internet connected through like the conventional methods of, providers, modems, routers, anything that was, publicly available, we were not, using that and file stories while we were inside with families and homes and with our loved ones and friends and, maybe neighbors or the places we would shelter at. So one of the things that, if we had internet available through these publicly available channels that survived bombardment and strikes, we would try to avoid, being around public, around neighbors, around friends and, family, so that if any kind of targeting happens, if any kind of monitoring or tracking happens for the reporter or the story that's coming out, it would be with the least kind of damage possible. So that was one of the things that, we did the math for on the spot.
Right. Stephen, you and your Reuters team did these incredible stories that won the Pulitzer Prize last year for the fentanyl trail coming from the chemicals in China to Mexico and onto the United States. Walk me through the first conversation you had with Reuters security people. I just see their heads exploding when you tell them what you're going to do. You're going to get fentanyl chemicals from China. You're going to talk to cartels in Mexico and lay out this whole pathway of how fentanyl starts in China and makes its way to the US. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, and the lawyers as well, the security team and the lawyers. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big challenges there was trying to obviously keep our team safe, the people that we're talking to, these sellers in China, and we did that through a couple of different ways. Initially we were using Tails operating systems on burner laptops, so basically stuff that was entirely disconnected from any system, certainly from the Reuters system, and
And who are you talking to? People in China who could.
So we would find numbers through the dark web. So yeah, on the dark web, you'd be able to find sellers that we then talk to through encrypted messaging services like Telegram or through WhatsApp and things like that. One of the kind of crazy things of that story is that we'd initially kind of built this kind of digital security system and going in through the dark web, and very quickly found that actually you could find a lot of these sellers just on Google, just on the normal internet. And so we ended up finding quite a lot of these sellers just through Google image searches, and then you would contact these sellers via WhatsApp or whatever it was, and pay for it in Bitcoin and get it delivered. And it would just arrive in packages about this size. We'd order like a kilo. And yeah, we had them delivered both in the US and here in Mexico City.
And you were identifying yourself as being from Reuters. Were you identifying yourself by name or just by company, by Reuters? And or were you being a little cagey at any points along the way?
We basically didn't volunteer any information in terms of kind of who we were. We didn't we neither lied as to who we were, and we didn't volunteer it either. But when we started to think about where we would have the stuff delivered, that was when we started to kind of have quite a lot of questions around. We didn't want to have it delivered to anyone's house. We were basically quite careful about. We were worried about individual journalists being identified through this process and maybe being kind of mistaken for being cartel members or something like that. And so in the end, the decision in Mexico was made that the safest place was to have it delivered to the Reuters office. So there we did decide that it was safer to kind of receive it as Reuters the company as opposed to an individual at their home address or whatever. And the Reuters address is just on one of the main avenues, a high-rise building, main avenues in Mexico City. And it was trying to get that balance between keeping our journalists safe, but then also not disguising everything so much that we really came across as criminal actors in this. So we wanted, particularly getting a sent to the Reuters address, to make it kind of, if someone had wanted to look up, who was buying it, it would become pretty clear that it was a news organization.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And did you always get what you ordered, or was it
Most of the time, but we got ripped off quite a few times. There was one case, where we had stuff sent to the US, and so we would receive the stuff, then we would get it tested at like a labs that have all this kind of really fancy, testing equipment to figure out what it was, so that we could really say it's definitively this fentanyl precursor or that. And so we had this kind of white powder arrive in the US, send it to the fancy lab, do all the tests on it, and these chemists just could not figure out what it was, and they spent ages coming back and forth and saying we don't know what it is. And in the end, it turned out to be sugar. So that we just used gone through all of this complicated purchasing just to get some sugar that we could have bought around the corner. But
yeah, yeah. Okay.
it's
So
it's a criminal marketplace,
not an entirely honest business is what I'm hearing here.
No.
Hold that thought. We'll follow up on that.